Well, we are in Luke chapter 9 tonight, and Tyler was able to get through a little bit of this first part of the chapter last week. What I'd like for us to do this evening is go back and look at verses 1 through 17, read through verses 1 through 17, and then we'll give him a chance to share any review that he wants on those first few verses. And then once we get past that review, we'll dig a little bit deeper into the rest of these remaining verses for tonight. We're in a section from verses 1 through 50, but we're only probably going to be able to discuss 1 through 17 this evening. So we're in Luke chapter 9, and so we've got our Amen Corner ready to go tonight, so that's awesome. Great. Okay, so when Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. He told them, take nothing for the journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, leave their town and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. So they set out and went from village to village, proclaiming the good news and healing people everywhere. Now Herod, the Tetrarch, heard about all that was going on, and he was perplexed because some were saying that John had been raised from the dead, others that Elijah had appeared, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago had come back to life. But Herod said, I beheaded John. Who then is this I hear such things about? And he tried to see him. When the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. And then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. But the crowds learned about it and followed him. And he welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed healing. Late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him and said, send the crowd away so they can go to surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we are in a remote place here. He replied, you give them something to eat. And they answered, we have only fish and loaves of bread. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for all this crowd. About 5,000 men were there. But he said to his disciples, have them sit down in groups of about 50 each. The disciples did so, and everyone sat down, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them, and then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. So may God bless the reading of his word. I want to pause here and give Tyler an opportunity just to kind of unpack anything that he wants to, particularly in that first section. And then I've got a couple of notes that I'll chime in as well, and then we'll turn our attention to the feeding of the 5,000. So Tyler, I'm going to punt to you for the next little bit.
In that first section?
Yeah, just in this first section of those first, 12? 9 verses, yeah.
All right. Well, hello. The problem I've had with these next chapter or so is that I imagined it as a mountain, which is nice because in the middle of this big section is a mountain. They go up on the mountain and the transfiguration happens. But kind of on each side of the mountain, there is a parallel kind of teaching that feeds off of each other until you kind of get to the top of the transfiguration happens. So I'm kind of having trouble only teaching the first part without grouping in the second. So I'll try to do that. But so on this side, he says, take nothing for your journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, nor money. Don't have 2 tunics. So that is a kind of a reliance on God's provision for discipleship, at least for their current situation, for their current mission. Can you apply that to modern discipleship? Sure. I don't think that was his direct application because it was a short mission. He even told them in Matthew that the Son of Man will be vindicated before you're done. So he's like, this is quick. We're going to go. And then it's actually only lasts a chapter. They come back and you hear that they come back And you don't hear Jesus' response to it until later when he denounces the cities, but they come back. And then he says it the 72. So this is a limited instruction. So it's not like if you're going to be a missionary somewhere, you're not allowed to take anything. That's not his intention. Mm-hmm. Nor can you be an ineffective missionary or disciple if you have extra clothes. That's not what he's saying. But what he wants them to do is a principle we need, is to rely on the provision of God for our journey. So that's a very common thing. That's throughout the Bible, you can get that. As for the reason I think that they were supposed to do that was because they, one, rely on God's provision, but what you should also see rather in that is Jesus from this point on kind of models that, which I learned today, which I was blown away by. I had not caught that. Jesus tells them, don't bring extra stuff, don't bring food, don't bring anything, basically telling them not that he wants them to go hungry, but rely on God to provide that. And if you look through the rest of Luke, it's like almost every scene, Jesus is doing that in Zacchaeus' house, or with the Pharisee who invites him in and lets him eat a meal. Or when they get to Jerusalem, he says, go find a man carrying a water jar, see if we can stay at his house. Almost every step of the way, and even when they get to the Jerusalem, they stay in a Gethsemane. And that was provided by someone else who said that they could stay in there. And which is, interestingly, even his tomb was donated by a rich man. It's like, he models this every step of the way up after this point of, once he leaves Nazareth or Capernaum, he says, I'm going to show you what relying on God for provision looks like. And then when he eats, he goes and he finds Zacchaeus, or he goes and eats with the Pharisee, or he goes and eats with it at a person's house. We'll get to who that is in Passion Week. But I love that model that he himself obeys. And then, of course, it's modeled first by the bread from heaven in this next story where the bread comes from God, presumably mimicking that Exodus account. But I was interested in that today. As for the shake the dust off your feet, Greg found an interesting reference that you put in the handout. And it may be out of Isaiah, I don't know. It does say lick the dust from your feet in Isaiah. It's a strange reference, and it may be, I don't know, but that is one. Another, I've heard a few explanations. I think I mentioned this last week. One I would say is not true, which the people I rely on pretty heavily for first century Jewish rabbinic culture studies said that there was like this ceremony, there's a teaching going around, which often happens, that there's a ceremony in Jewish culture where, when you leave someone's town, you shake the dust off your feet, saying I don't even want the dust from your town to cling to me because you're going to hell. That may be it, but that was some formal ceremony. I don't know. But they said that that's not in any rabbinic literature at any point. There's stuff like that happens, which is kind of frustrating because, you try to teach the cultural stuff, but then people end up making their own, and then that gets copied by other preachers or whatever, and then that kind of gets passed down like one that'll bum you up. But even like when Jesus resurrects, it says his cloth was folded in the tomb, and a huge teaching went around for a long time, and still is pretty pervasive, that when you fold your cloth, that means you're coming back to your meal, you're just going to the bathroom or something. And so that means Jesus is coming back. But when you just kind of crumple it up and throw it on your plate, that means that you finished with your meal. And so when Jesus folds it, that means he's coming back. That sounds great, but that's completely made up. And there's absolutely no reference to that anywhere. But it preaches really well. So stuff like that, because you're probably like, whoa, I wish that was true. So stuff like that kind of pervades pretty heavily. Yeah. And that idea of them having plates or napkins wasn't really, just you got to look at the culture for like 10 seconds. You're like, okay, well, they didn't have plates or napkins, or, they didn't have forks and knives. And Jesus probably didn't have a servant in his home. It was not, that would be a very Greek thing for Jesus to do. But all that to say, we don't know exactly what the reference is. There's a few potential things. One is it's referring to Sodom and Gomorrah, where they were punished because of their inhospitality, and the dust that clings off, and Jesus later says it'll be more bearable for the day of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. It could be a reference to that. It could also be just you want nothing to do with that town. You're marking them as unclean because even the dust from like a Gentile city would be unclean. Another one linking with the hospitality would be they shouldn't, you could say, and one suggestion from someone I respect a lot as a writer, one suggestion is that they shouldn't have had dust on their feet because when they go into someone's house, they should have washed it, like the Last Supper. You wash their feet when you go for a meal, and so if you go into someone's house and don't wash your feet, leave and shake the dust that shouldn't even be on your feet off to remind them this is why you're being judged, because you didn't receive the kingdom well. That could be it. I don't know. Jesus doesn't tell us. He wants us to figure it out. So I certainly don't know, but they leave. And then you get this interesting section where it says, now Herod was perplexed about all that was happening, because it was said by some, this is another mountain part where there's an equal on different in a different section. It was said by some that Elijah had appeared, or others that a prophet of old has risen. And that's exactly what Jesus then asks Peter, who do the people say I am? He says that you're John the Baptist risen from the dead, or a different prophet. It's exactly what Peter says. So Herod is kind of representing the so far unbelieving crowds of people. But just I love the idea that Herod wants to see Jesus. It's very interesting that it's not a random detail. It's connected that Herod at this point now wants to see Jesus, but which makes sense then why, at least which is hard because in Luke, it doesn't say that Jesus told Peter not to tell anyone when Peter said Jesus was the Messiah. Peter says, you're the Messiah, son of the living God, in Matthew. And Jesus says, that's perfect. Flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father who's above, but don't tell anyone. Probably because that would be a direct challenge to Herod and Caesar and everyone. That's something Jesus isn't ready for. His hour hasn't come yet. He'll do that in Jerusalem. That's exactly what he tells someone to tell Herod. Say, well, I can't die away from Jerusalem, so I'll meet you in Jerusalem. So I just love that we get this little thread of that more Herod stuff coming up. But he's interested and wants to see which is interesting because the crowds, I think that phrase is used elsewhere, word for word, that he was interested and wanted to see Jesus, and that same phrase is used of the crowds. They're interested and want to see Jesus, almost relating them. And it's not enough to just want to see and be interested in Jesus, because even Herod wants that. So that's all I got for that introduction section, I think.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I completely forgot the most important part. The 12. I mean, just the idea of picking 12, that's almost so lost on us because it's like it's one of those things we know it's a biblical number, but we don't really know why. Just the idea of Jesus first picking 12 disciples, what you have to see in that is the Assyrian invasion in 734 BC. Since then, they basically took the northern tribes, left Judah, the southern tribes, and the northern tribes are basically no more, and the remnant God preserved was Judah. So when that really narrowed it down, and it says a line will come from the tribe of Judah, that narrows it down pretty significantly when almost all the tribes go into exile, never to return. But the fact that Jesus is picking 12 disciples very much is showing that if he proclaims in Luke 4, remember his mission statement in the synagogue in Nazareth, he proclaims in Luke 4 that basically exile is over and the Sabbath is being brought and the year of Jubilee is being brought in me, and it's going to the Gentiles and they get mad. But the idea of him picking 12 is showing that the exiled tribes are being restored in him, and he's bringing them back. And actually what he tells the disciples is, I'll make you make you fishers of men, which is out of Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah, he's saying, I'll go get the tribes back like fishers. I'll go and fish for men and bring them back. So Jesus is very clearly thinks in flesh. He is the one bringing the tribes back, which is a Luke theme from literally Luke 1:1 to the end of Acts. It's that the exiled tribes being restored back. Remember all those threads going through. It's like 100 different threads going all throughout Luke that you can just constantly, and sometimes they get really intertwined in one moment and it gets really confusing. Like there's probably not one that's more intertwined other than the cross than the transfiguration. There's like 5 threads all coming together in this one moment, which is just masterful writing to use one event for 5 different themes in this giant narrative. It's amazing. But just I just wanted to make sure you know the idea of the 12 disciples. There hasn't been 12 since 734 BC. There hasn't been 12 for a long time. So that's saying something pretty significant. So I got the first section.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so I want to pause just for a second, and I want to see if any of you all have any questions. A couple of things we want to say about it in just here in a second. But also, some of you may not just have a question. You may also have an observation related to any of these pieces, the dust off your feet part, or the Bethesda part, or the Herod part. So feel free to speak out if you have any questions or comments.
Greg, I learned by reading The Dust of the Rabbi, I can't remember her name's like Spurberg or something like that, Lois, I think. She made some comment about how when he dusted off his feet, or he told them to dust their feet off, how ironic that was, because when you were with the rabbi, you even wanted the dust from his feet upon you. You wanted all parts of the rabbi upon you. And then the fact that they are wanting to get shake all the dust from them. I don't know, it kind of meant a lot to me. And so maybe you can make something out of that.
I mean, yeah, maybe in a rabbinic sense, they would have heard that differently, especially because he's about to talk about discipleship at the Transfiguration. But if you don't know what she's talking about, there was an old phrase in I think the Mishnah that said, "May you follow your rabbi so closely, even the dust that flies off of his feet stick to you, and may you always be covered in the dust of your rabbi," because you're always. So that image of when Jesus is walking somewhere and stops, all his disciples run into the back of him like dominoes, because they're always because if he's speaking and teaching, you want to be right beside him and hearing everything he says. So that was a very common kind of blessing in the first century. And so what she was kind of saying is like, when he says, shake off the dust from your feet, meaning they don't want anything to do with following this rabbi. So maybe, I haven't even thought about that. Maybe definitely the rabbinic culture would have heard that very differently. So that's pretty interesting.
Good thoughts. Anybody else have any observations or thoughts based on what we've covered so far?
Mm.
12 baskets. Okay.
12 baskets.
12 baskets left over. Yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get to that in just a moment. I think there are some ties there for sure, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Great question, Roy. Thank you. Anybody else have questions or comments before we move on? So on the handout that you've got at the bottom, I just want to kind of revisit for a few moments really Luke is masterful, as Tyler just said, at multiple levels of stories going on simultaneously. But if we look at this kind of through the lens of I don't really like the word formula because I think it's got a negative connotation, but there really are three directives that Jesus gives, and I think these are really important because as Tyler and Jaina both have pointed out several times in the last few weeks, none of this is by accident. It's very, very specific and very purposeful in design. But I do think that this idea of taking nothing, we don't want to overly spiritualize that, but there is a spiritual component. I think Tyler's observation that it is seasonal is spot on. And if you go a little bit later, if you want to cross-reference this in Luke chapter 22, Jesus actually kind of brings this full circle and makes the observation that, now you have the cloak, now you have the purse. I don't think that's the exact language that he uses. You have the sword. So now that you have these things, there's kind of a different spin on it. Use it wisely. But I love this quote by Joel Green that during this particular phase of their apprenticeship, they are to depend on village hospitality. And we're a very hospitable church. As a matter of fact, the A&M Church is probably one of the most hospitable churches I have ever been part of, to just watch how you as a church open your homes and you open your hearts and you open your bank accounts. And, we're just an extremely hospitable church. But at this particular time, hospitality is a huge deal. There's honor associated with hospitality. There's shame associated with lack of hospitality. Even if you were an enemy, if you rode into an enemy's camp and you asked for hospitality, the enemy would typically have to afford you at least a certain measure of hospitality because of the way that honor and shame was associated with that particular component. And so Jesus here is really focusing on this idea of hospitality and leveraging it for a kingdom purpose. And so I think it's really, really cool that there's multiple levels of the hospitality dynamic that's in play here. And am I making more of that than I need to, or do you see this hospitality dynamic as well?
I mean, hospitality is like how you exist, basically. Like if people weren't hospitable, it was like you wouldn't live. And especially like if you're in prison, or if you were a female and your husband or your father had died, you would die unless someone took care of you. Sometimes that's supposed to be the closest relative. Sometimes it's supposed to be the priest, which Jesus will address later. But hospitality was how you lived. If you're in prison, they didn't bring you food like our prisons. You just sat in a cell and someone either came to visit you and brought you food or didn't. And that's basically how you survived. So that was like such an emphasis for, and I love that early church emphasis is the widows, orphans, because the people who are not cared for, you have to be hospitable for them.
Yeah.
So it's something we can apply culturally, I think.
Well, I think, again, as I said earlier, not to over spiritualize, but if you think about what's happening here, one of the things that we in America struggle with, and it's not I don't want to speak in terms of absolutes, but our rugged individualism sometimes can be problematic when it relates to hospitality. You know, I want to grow my bank account. I want to make my house bigger. I want to get my car nicer, whatever it is, fill in the blank. And so, one of the reasons that the church exists and why the principles of how the church functions, why those principles are timeless, is because we swim against that narrative. You know, if we have riches, we take those riches, we use those riches as a means to a gospel end, not to build bigger barns, if that makes sense. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Any additional insights or thoughts, questions?
Actually, I just like that. Your idea of building barns is one of Jesus' teachings, obviously.
Right.
But that the comedic part to that was that you don't build, first century Jewish culture, you don't build barns. That was like not heard of. Like to us, it's like, well, don't fill your barns. Like to them, even having a barn was like, you're being incredibly selfish because your leftover food or wheat you give to the poor and the marginalized. And so the fact, it's not just he's like being self-reliant or storing up materialistic stuff. It's like, no, he's literally lacking because of his individualism. He's not caring for the poor. And that's like, so it's like, at what point we would have laughed and what point they would have laughed for like different. I always try to notice that. They would have laughed at, he built a barn? Like what, he built they have 40 people living in one room, but this guy goes and builds a barn for himself. So there's also storehouses for the temple, which are pretty interesting.
Interesting. They to accept the hospitality. It's much easier for us to provide hospitality than to accept it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that can happen too. And that may be where part of our individualism also comes into play. I've often heard church members use a phrase that's very puzzling to me. It's a phrase, I don't want to bother anybody. I don't want to bother you. I don't want to tie up your time. And most of the time, my response to that, depending on the nature of what's going on, is, but that's why the church exists. You know, we're here for each other. And if you rob someone an opportunity to bless you, then, you know, that's taking away from them how the Spirit might be moving. And so, you know, there's so many fascinating things on either side of this. You know, I think, and I may be seeing too much, I may be reading more into this than I should be, but I think that Jesus is still leveraging his teaching on the parable of the soils, because he's still trying to help them understand. And even this next point, once welcome into a home, stay there until you leave the town or until you leave the village. So there's the particular thorns, if we can use that language, of those things that come up and choke us. You know, it's very possible that the apostles themselves could have fallen into the trap of house hopping until they got the nicer gig, you know, the bigger bed, the private room, I don't know, the courtyard view, whatever it might have been. And you may think, well, they wouldn't have done that. Well, it's not too much longer. It's only like, what, a couple of chapters away, right? They're going to be arguing about which one of them is the greatest.
Yeah.
And so they still have this, and even though we're seeing them go out and they're casting out demons in Jesus's name, and they're healing in Jesus's name, and not literally days later, where are we going to get food? So even though they're getting it, is it safe to say they haven't gotten it? Is that? Am I saying
they've seen but haven't seen? Yeah.
Yeah. They've seen it, but they're not seeing it.
It's funny because he's I don't know how to explain it. You got to the right conclusion, but you took like the back way, because in Mark, that's exactly how Mark teaches it. Was Jesus feeds the 5,000, and then they get on a boat, go to the other side. They realize we forgot to bring bread, and they start fighting on the boat. And so then he gets off the boat and he heals a blind man, meaning he's like, well, sorry, he heals a blind man once. And says, open your eyes, what do you see? He says, I see people, they look like trees. Does it again, he says, now you saw, but you didn't see, but now you see. So he's like, I love it. Yeah. But it's like, Greg just like hit on exactly what Jesus taught. Was like, they saw Jesus do the miracle, feeding 5,000, but it had no effect on how they actually trusted in God's provision. So to show Jesus, to show them how they're being, he goes and heals a blind man twice to show the first time didn't take, so we got to do it again because you didn't get it. But
Yeah.
it's fascinating.
Which is incredible when you think about that particular story, that we scratch our heads and we go, why did Jesus not have enough power?
Yeah.
But it had nothing to do with that. It's he's using it as a teaching opportunity. So quite fascinating. This last piece, and then we're going to move on because I want to make sure that we have time to get to the other section. But Jesus, and he doesn't use these words, so these are my words, but I think thematically, I think they're on target. Is this just you're going to have to be prepared for rejection, and so and it may be why Luke inserts even the Herod piece right here where he does as well. Not just the rejection that they're going to experience in the town, but kind of this ominous presence who's always kind of lurking in the background as a dangerous part of the equation. But Jesus had already experienced rejection. We saw this earlier, right, in Luke chapter 4. And then a little bit noted there about the shaking off the dust. I think we talked about that enough tonight. But I do think it's important that even today, and again, multiple layers here happening simultaneously, but even today, we're going to have to be prepared for rejection. In our world, it's easy to find it these days. I mean, because more and more people are turning their backs on God, more and more people are falling into that N-O-N-E category. Agnosticism is growing, atheism is growing, particularly in our culture. And so if we have not experienced rejection before, we need to be preparing for it, even as Jesus was preparing the 12 here for it as they went town to town. So anyway, any additional thoughts? Anybody, questions, observations before we look at this next piece here? Do you have any additional comments on anything?
Yeah.
Okay. I love this. I love the cutaway to the Herod piece for multiple reasons. Luke doesn't want to let his audience, hey, don't lose sight of the fact that one of the bad guys is still trying to exert his influence. And so back in the day, we used to always have this meanwhile back at the ranch thing, or meanwhile back in, back in the hometown or whatever. And so it's kind of it's a sort of literary device that Luke is using to keep suspense and to keep tension, but it's much, much more than that. It's not just a literary device. I don't mean to demean it and belittle it. But it's certainly Herod is still very much part of what's going on here. And I've listed several references in Luke Acts where we see the Herods kind of continuing to operate behind the scenes as a couple of the bad guys. But I think the most important takeaway for me is that Jesus doesn't let his disciples off the hook. And for people who just want to feel good Jesus, they're not going to find it here, because he wants his disciples to understand, if you're going to follow me, you have to understand that there is a high probability that you're going to have to experience the exact same fate that I've signed up for. And so it's not a cream puff message, and it's not a cream puff Jesus. Herod asked the question, who is this? And it's kind of fascinating, because really, I mean, Luke's been teasing us all along, but really from now until the end of Luke's gospel, he answers the question. So he uses this unbeliever who asked the question, who is this, to say, okay, hey, it's a really good question, Herod. I'm going to go ahead and start showing you now, for the rest of the gospel who Luke is, or who Jesus is. So anything else to this point? I don't want to race ahead and not have a chance to process what we've talked about so far. Okay, so the apostles come back and they start to give a report of what they've done. And I think I'm right in this, but I'd love for Tyler and Jaina to clarify and make sure we're all on the same page. 2 Bethesdas, right?
Bethsaida?
Yeah, two Bethsaidas.
There's Bethesda and Bethsaida, yeah.
Okay.
Bethesda is pretty far away.
Okay, yeah. All right.
Bethsaida has kind of yet to be discovered. They found a city. They don't know if it's it or not. It was farther away from the coast of the Sea of Galilee than they thought it was, if that matters to anyone.
Okay.
But, which is interesting, because if they could, that means it's been untouched. If they couldn't find it, that means it hasn't been built over, which means if they could excavate it, they could find a synagogue there, almost certainly, that Jesus would have stood in, which We have a synagogue in Gamla that was original that Jesus may have stood in. Well, almost certainly, because it says he went to all the cities of Galilee. So that one's whether he went to Gamla, which is very hostile, even to Pharisees, was questionable. Maybe he did. That's probably where he got Simon the Zealot, I would suppose. But if they could excavate Bethsaida and they could confirm it's Bethsaida and they could find a synagogue, because everywhere else is built over, Capernaum, Nazareth, everywhere's built over already. But that would be pretty neat. We could go and see a synagogue he for sure went in.
Yeah, that would be way cool. That'd be way cool. So, but what we think here, if I read this correctly, is that this particular city where they are. So we're reading here, the apostles return, verse 11. Then he took them, verse 10, with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. This is East Coast, right? Northeast.
Northeast. Yeah.
Northeast. Okay.
Supposedly.
Okay. But we think the birthplace of Peter, Andrew, and Philip.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, any questions about that? Any thoughts? Are we all tracking together? It's not. I mean, it is important, but in the great scheme of things, it's not a huge deal. But it's important at least to know where they are, particularly as they're coming and going, because there's some greater cleanliness and uncleanliness dynamics in play. Why didn't Jesus, for example, why is it not recorded that Jesus shook the dust off of his feet, when he traveled from Gentile territories to Jewish territories? Speculation. In the great scheme of things, it doesn't matter, but it's important to know where they are, I think. We have the theme of withdrawal here as well, and it's very, very purposeful, but I think it's important to know that prayer is very vital to the mission of Jesus, but when the mission of Jesus comes calling, Jesus, he pauses this season of withdrawal, and he engages the crowd, and it's a really, really beautiful thing to see, I think. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this next section. I'm going to stop talking. I've been talking long enough. You guys may want to address some of these issues here, beginning in verse 12. Roy had a question about the baskets, so I want to make sure we see that. And I'm going to also look. We had another question that's come in. So, reference to et tel and the handout. I thought it stood for an ancient city like Tel Gezer. Note the question above, and then the 12 baskets. Yeah. I think that is that I think it could be known as et tel, but I don't know any more than that. That was just a reference in the Cultural Background Study Bible, so that's the source for that observation. They're just saying that it could be et tel.
That's it.
Yes. Yeah.
What was that written? It may have gotten updated since then.
Could be.
Yeah. It was very recent that they think they found, but saying like in the past few years. So depending on when that was written, it could be dated. It kind of depends on when college students are in school, because they're the ones who come and do all the hard labor of digging, while the people who already have their degree tell them where to dig. And so you go there during the summer, and you can literally just walk into Bet Shemesh, no problem. I shouldn't have, but I took a pig bone from one site at Bet Shemesh, because it's literally, I think that was illegal, but it's literally because there's no one digging. But then you can't go there during like the fall and spring, because there's college students everywhere. But so it's like you'll get a lot of progress, and they all go back to school and learn about what they did. Then you get a lot of progress for fall and spring. So it's or summer when they're off school is when they dig everything. So anyway, yeah.
Cool.
I'll keep you updated.
There you go. And when they start hosting trips to Israel, you guys can go over and we can do some digging together. So that'll be
probably not. That's illegal.
Maybe we'll watch other people dig. That might be.
If you even want to put your shovel into the ground in Israel, you have to have like 3 permits, and someone has to come excavate it for you. Someone has to come. It's like
wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. Okay, so let's look at verse 12 and beyond, and any observations you guys have about that. We have again the reference to the 12. Send the crowd away, and then we get into the feeding of the 5,000. So, thoughts, observations
about feeding the 5,000,
and then about the 12 baskets too, if you have any.
Yeah, that'll come in. There's feeding of the 5,000. That's in Matthew and Luke, and then Mark adds feeding of the 4,000. He adds feeding of the 5,000, some events in between, and then feeding of the 4,000. And this is just a great example of they're not the same event. They're not just two things that happen in that. They just happen to have different numbers of people. But this one is very steeped in symbolism, as you can tell by 5 loaves and the 2 fish and the 12 baskets and dividing them into groups of 50. It's like, he's like kind of throwing a bunch of very obviously symbolic numbers at you. All those numbers is very symbolic. 50 less so, but 5 and 2 is like huge, and 12 baskets left over is huge. If you look at the 4,000 in Mark is very much trying to prove a point. So the way that Luke shows you that the gospel is going to the Gentiles is Jesus has rejection of the kingdom by the Jewish cities, and he sends out the 72 to the nations. Luke also has a lot more time to write Acts, so he's got a lot more space. But the way that Mark does it is has feeding of the 5,000 and then feeding of the 4,000. The feeding of the 4,000, 4 is symbolic of the 4 corners of the earth. So that's all the nations. And that's exactly because in their mind, Israel was the middle of the known world. That's why everyone always fought over it. And then the 4 corners of the earth was symbolic of the nations everywhere. So the 4 and 1,000 are 2 different words in Greek. So it's the 4 and the 1,000. So the 4 corners. Same thing for Peter. There was I think Luke specifically says there was a sheet brought down on 4 of its corners. That was not about, we can eat hot dogs now. The point was, all the people of the 4 corners of the earth, don't call them unclean if God called them clean. It's like, it's way deeper. So it's very symbolic of all the clean and unclean of the earth, the 4 corners being brought down in front of Peter, and God says, go to all of them. Because Peter was a racist for a while. He had a hard, not rate, it's pretty extreme, but he had a really hard time going to Gentiles. It took him 3 visions to even get it. It was hard for him to accept that. Even Paul had to rebuke him for falling back into his kind of passiveness. And then in the feeding of the 4,000, there's no 50, there's no 2, there's no 5, but there are 7 baskets left over. 7, as you probably know, is a word for complete, or a number for completeness. But what 7 also is in the Old Testament is the number of pagan nations. So there is enough baskets left over to go to all the pagan nations over the whole 4 corners of the earth. And that is, I think, Jesus' clear teaching there is, this is him acting as Moses, not only for the Jews, but for the pagan nations in the 4 corners of the earth. And that would have been a shocking teaching. And that was actually interpreted that way pretty early on, like Origen, early church fathers got that pretty quick. But as far as this one, it's like so symbolic, you may not even believe it. But first of all, I like that the disciples ask, we need to care for these people. So that's good. They're wanting to care for people. And Jesus says, okay, you feed them. It's like, well, we can't feed. We have 5 loaves and 2 fish. And those are symbolic numbers because the 5 books of Moses, bread, we have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. The 10 Commandments were written on 2 tablets. It's like 2 Moses things. So Jesus takes the Moses things, the 5 books of Moses and the 10 Commandment tablets, and divides them and gives them to the people that were broken up into groups of 50. And if you look in Deuteronomy, Moses broke up the people into groups of 50. And he put people over them and then gave, what it said was that basically when they have a dispute, they would go to their elders over them. If there's a huge dispute, they go to Moses. And so basically he was ministering the word, is how you would say it now, ministering the word to them, interpreting God's law to them. So that was Moses' job. And that is like a huge Jewish symbolism, is that the word is the bread. And that is exactly what the whole lesson in Deuteronomy 8 was that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. By the book, you live by the text. They didn't have it written down yet, but you live by the text that God teaches you through Moses. But you don't need food to live. You need God's word to live. And he knew you needed food to physically live. But he didn't want you to, he wanted you to trust God. And so that was just like saying that carried on. That's Jesus' point too, was in the wilderness. He even quotes that. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. That's the true bread that we need to sustain ourselves. So that 5 loaves is just huge that he distributes that. The 2 fish, same thing, 10 Commandments, the tablets coming from Moses. The 12 baskets left over, I think, is just going to the 12 tribes of Israel. It's that there's enough left over for the bread to go to Israel, but there's a little bit deeper than that, I think. And this may be a stretch, so think about it. I didn't make this up. I got it from some people way smarter than me. But like I said, on each side of the transfiguration, there's kind of this parallel idea to it, and the climax of it is the transfiguration on the mountain. I would think that in verse 44, the parallel to this would be to the breaking of the bread, and they eat it. Not only is that very clearly referencing the Israelites in the wilderness, it's very obvious. I think a less obvious one is that is clearly saying that Jesus says, let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man, the bread of life, is about to be delivered into the hands of men. And it's exactly what happens to the bread is it's handed over to men. They broke it and they ate it. And what it says was they were full and satisfied. They ate and were satisfied. And that sounds good, but that's actually a very technical term in the Deuteronomy for the covenant blessing. God says, if you obey my covenant, you will eat and be full and be satisfied. So he's very clearly, Luke is drawing an allusion to the covenant blessing of the old covenant, that if they lived by the covenant, they would eat and be satisfied. But if you look, what happens is they break the bread and they eat the bread, and that's what makes them full and satisfied. So it's the delivering of the Son of Man to the hands of men is what causes them, the covenant, to be fulfilled in Jesus. That could be a reference to, I think, that maybe that. But then the 12 baskets left over is that the covenant is being fulfilled to all 12 tribes. And like I said, there hasn't been 12 tribes for hundreds of years. And so that is like going back to the 12 tribes, that they're going to, again, see that bread that God provides in the wilderness. And along them, that's a less obvious one. I should have started with the more obvious one. And very clearly, this is Jesus being Moses. I mean, he's screaming it at you. Jesus being Moses, that God is providing bread through Moses for the people of Israel. Like it says they're in a desolate place, in a Ramos Tapos. It would be not in the wilderness, but it's a term used for the wilderness. But it's an actually technical term for a place around Bethsaida, where it's basically unfarmable land, so that you didn't go and have 5,000 people stepping on someone's crops. You would go to an Ramos Tapos. It's a kind of a desolate place where you couldn't farm, and so they'd go and have their big meat. So we can almost pinpoint where this happened around Galilee. It's just a piece of land. It's not super exciting, but it's we know almost exactly where it happened because they farmed every square inch they could. So in the wilderness, bread is provided by God. Then the covenant is blessed in them if they do that, if they eat of that bread that God provides for them. So I'd say that is the symbolism there.
Okay. Cool. Questions, thoughts, observations? All right, we have a couple of more minutes left, so I don't know if there's anything else you guys want to hit on.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you really got to get, there's one interesting, well, there's a few interesting references. One is Deuteronomy 18, that God promises that one will come, a prophet greater than Moses, and you will listen to him. It's very important because there's about to be some blatantly obvious Moses figures here. For pretty much from here to the end of the book, this is kind of at least next week, will be the foundation that Luke builds the rest of the book on. Because notice Herod says, who is this person? And then, so there's all these threads tying together throughout Luke. So who Jesus' identity, what his identity is very important in Luke. Because you look at what the Romans say. They think he's an impostor king. You look at the Sadducees. They think he's a false prophet. You look at the Pharisees. They think he's a blasphemer, claiming to be God when he's not. You look at the Zealots. They think he's a pacifist. He's not going to fight. Or at least some of them think he is going to fight. So they think he's a Maccabee. You look at, everyone has a different reference. Herod thinks he's John the Baptist resurrected. A lot of the crowds think he's John the Baptist come back, or Elijah from Malachi. And then, so we see who Herod thinks he is. And then on the mountain, he says, Peter, who do you say I am? Or who do the crowds say I am? They say the same thing as Herod. So who do you say I am? So we get to see who Peter says he is. And then we get to hear who God says Jesus is. This is my son, from Psalm 2. Listen to him, from Deuteronomy 18. He's the prophet greater than Moses. And where does he do it other than Mount Sinai? At the figurative, symbolic Mount Sinai. He says, this is my son, from Psalm 2. Listen to him like the prophet from Deuteronomy 18. So all these Moses things are huge to understanding Jesus as the greater prophet from Deuteronomy, because there was punishment for not listening to him in Deuteronomy 18. You have to listen to him. So when God himself says, hey, by the way, he is the one, there's no question, and listen to him, that was huge. Another reference is in 2 Kings 4, Elisha does the same bread miracle that Jesus does, that Moses did, but that Jesus will do. He multiplies the bread to feed people. But if you see right after, there is the king who wants to know and see Elisha. He wants to see Elisha. But Elisha says to him, what does he say? He says, why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know there's a prophet in Israel. So I find that fascinating that Herod says, who is this? I want to see him. And then Jesus multiplies bread like Elisha. And in the Elisha story, there's a king wanting to see Elisha. And Elisha says, if he wants to see me so bad, he can come to me and I'll show him that there is a prophet in Israel. So that is, I mean, and if you track where Herod and John the Baptist or Herod and Jesus are moving, you can see Jesus almost following Herod all the way to Jerusalem where they'll eventually meet. But it's because we know where John the Baptist was beheaded and Jesus moved closer to there. It's very interesting. But I think that's an interesting reference to another thing. Let's see what else I want to do. Yeah, I would say that's it right now.
Okay.
But there's so much coming together. This next chapter is very crazy. There's a lot of stuff going on at once. So from like a cultural layer, from a textual layer, from a historical, it's so fascinating. But the biggest thing I think is just see that God, the God of Israel, is working through Jesus like he worked through Moses in order to bless the people in the covenant. And then next week we'll have our Sinai. Okay, the people come to the foot of Sinai. It's almost going to follow what happened to Deuteronomy when they come to Sinai. They come to Sinai, how are they acting? That's how the people are acting. What does Moses do? That's what Jesus does. What does God say? That's what God says on Sinai. It's like, and so you got to just start thinking about just Jesus as Moses, at least right now. And then there's a lot more that and I think there's a whole nother layer that John kind of gives it away, right? The whole, like, he's the bread of life. That's kind of stuff that you would get if you just meditated on this for a long time and thought about it. John just like, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Did he say that or not? I'm sure he did, but that's kind of what you need to see there is that Jesus is the bread. He's proclaiming to both be the God who provides the bread and the bread itself for those in the wilderness. And so if you would look at just read through the wilderness walkings, you would see that the whole point was he wanted them to trust God, but instead they grumbled against Moses, which God took his grumbling against himself, and so he punished them. So Moses is God's representative and priest on earth. So it's huge Moses stuff coming up. So 2 Kings 4. What? 2 Kings 4 was that reference?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you. And thank you everybody for tuning in tonight. We really, really appreciate you being here.